Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is John Sweeney. I am the editor at Living City Magazine, and this is a Living City conversation, which we have called Migration, What Happens Next? And we have a few presenters, speakers, panelists who are with us who are closely involved in what is happening right now on the ground when it comes to migration and immigration, because there's a lot happening. The theme of the magazine and the current issue is migration, what happens next? And two of our speakers here today are contributors to the magazine, and then we have one other, and I'm going to introduce them to you. Let me tell you just a couple of things of housekeeping. One is that we won't go longer than an hour. I know that everyone has other things to do, so you won't be here any longer than an hour. Another is that we have Spanish translation for you. I am told that most people are smarter than I am about these things, and that they probably know how to find it if they would like Spanish translation. But let me just say that you go down to the bottom and you click on More, or you click on Interpretation, or you click on More, and it takes you to something called Interpretation, and then you will find it there. And then you'll also find instructions in Espanol on your screen right now. So those are the housekeeping bits. Let me introduce our three speakers, and this is the order in which we're going to hear from them. Sister Eileen McKenzie is the author of the lead article in the magazine this month. It's called Let's Talk About Migration. And she does a great job of helping us to understand migration and immigration, and then offers 5 practices that every person can undertake in order to move from fear to faith in the area of this too often polarizing topic in the church and in the world. Sister Eileen is a Franciscan sister of perpetual adoration and is also a mobilization specialist with the Kino Border Initiative. She's coming to us from Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. The website of the Kino Border Initiative is exactly that, kinoborderinitiative.org. And then our second speaker will be Jennifer Tomshack, who is the author of another important article in the magazine this month. It is called Maryknoll Lay Missioners Help Migrants on Both Sides of the U.S. Southern Border, in which she talks about people putting faith in action near El Paso, Texas, in the 50th anniversary of a vital Catholic mission sending community. Jennifer's coming to us from St. Joseph, Michigan. She is communications manager for Maryknoll Lay Missioners. Her background includes years of experience in nonprofit communications and as a journalist in Catholic and secular media. And you can learn more about Maryknoll Lay Missioners at mklm.org, MKLM as in maryknolllaymissioners.org. And then our third speaker will be Todd Scribner, who is Assistant Director for Education and Outreach with Migration and Refugee Services at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB. Todd's coming to us from Washington, D.C. So those are our three speakers. First, we're going to turn to Sister Eileen. Sister Eileen, thank you for being here. And I'm going to sort of turn it over to you. Give us some understanding about migration in the way that you do in the magazine so well.
Thank you so much, John, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for being here today. I think that the major focus of what my reflection in the magazine was about is just simply how do we have even conversations about migration that offers us these points of encounter. Right? As Pope Francis has said, when we encounter a migrant, we're encountering Christ. And yet, really, most of us, when we say the word migration, we realize immediately that it can be a very divisive topic. And so my hope in the reflection that I shared in the magazine was to simply perhaps invite a faithful reflection of it, and invite a longer view of it, and then to give some very practical advice that we like to share with people who come to us at the Keno Border Initiative for different programs, and that we're trying to do in our outreach for just changing the narrative, which is an important thing to do these days. One of the basic things I think the invitation is to recognize that migration is natural in creation. It's something that creatures do when their living environment no longer sustains their life. And in the magazine article, I referred to how we love to see the geese, flying north or south, and they're harbingers of the changing seasons. Or I look out my window here in the Sonoran Desert and see the hummingbirds going away, and it's this beautiful reflection. And as a Franciscan, that much more so. But when we think of people and their migration and their migration patterns, we have a completely different view of that, which is really unfortunate. And it's, again, a point of divisiveness. And I would say an invitation to conversion for those of us who are following, the Judeo-Christian faiths, because really, Jesus was born into a family in migration. We celebrated right after Christmas. Christmas, Jesus was born in a manger, and they couldn't find a place to stay. That's the reason the Mexican posadas are so beautiful, such beautiful celebrations here in Mexico around raising consciousness around who our neighbors are and how do we invite them into an area where they can have safety and security. I think it's really important that we as Christians, and anyone who, certainly Catholics, when we look at the theology of migration, and we not only see how Jesus was born into poverty, but Jesus was born into a situation of his documentation, the family's documentation status being questioned, simply by being on the road to a population count, and then immediately afterwards becoming refugees into Egypt. And as people of the Christian faith, we see this not as a terrible thing. We actually believe that our Messiah, that Jesus the Christ, was born into this, thereby making it a sacred experience. And I don't think that many people who have this experience, particularly those of us who are at the southern U.S. border, on the border with Mexico, these are not the experiences that many people are having. I sense that as we have more conversations around it, it becomes very important that we recognize how complex the issue is, and that we do no one a favor by simplifying it by saying that it is either here or there. It's either a humanitarian issue or a security issue. It's actually both. And so to recognize that we can try and be compassionate, at the same time try and be safe. Having people who are vetted well come into our country and become part of our communities is very possible. And that's what we call for in immigration reform with our government. I'm going to just quickly talk about 5 different practices that I think that if we each practice this and invited each other to practice it, could move us into just some more constructive conversations, some more encounters, really, allowing the Spirit to move us into the next right step in being neighbors, as Christians like to call themselves. I think the first and most important thing is that we have to remember that we're talking about people. The dehumanizing and the crisis orienting and the criminalization of people who are on the move in the world right now is not doing anyone a favor or treating them with dignity and the dignity of the personhood. So we need to realize that these are people. And I even think that sometimes the word migrant or asylum seeker can be rather dehumanizing, and to keep it just person focused, to talk about people who are on the move, newcomers to our area. This is a really important aspect. And I think that it's helpful to also think about our own migration experiences. How many times have you moved in your life? Or how many times have people in your immediate family moved? Very few of us, particularly in the United States, live in the same places where we were born or where our parents or certainly grandparents were born. So what is your own migration story? Why did you move? Why did your family move? What was that like? What was it like to come into a new place? The more we can get in touch with our own migration story, the more it opens us up to hear the migration stories of others. I really recommend that we talk with people who have recently come into our communities, people who have migrated from different cultures or different countries, and just to listen to their story, nothing else but to listen to their story. And with an open heart, and if we thought about our own story, there is often some sort of a connection. Some of these stories, however, we can't connect with because, quite frankly, people who are coming from violent situations have quite traumatic stories. And that, my hope, is that it can at least move us into a place of compassion. Instead of focusing on facts and figures and things when we're talking about migration with others, perhaps our family members, people from different political parties, that doesn't seem to get us anywhere. Everyone has their own fact and everyone has their own argument, but focusing on shared values really helps. When I talk with some of my sisters and they're saying, well, we can't save the whole world. I said, no, you're right. We can't save the whole world, but we can try to be compassionate. All of us want to be compassionate. Do we want to be compassionate at the risk of safety? No, all of us want to be safe. Even the people who are moving into our neighborhoods are moving, looking for safety and security. So focusing on those shared values often will bring us at least into a place of meeting halfway, or at least not becoming more divisive. And finally, I really recommend sharing personal stories. When I talk about my experience with the children who are here in Kino and playing with them, and I share those stories with some people who are probably a little bit more afraid and wondering about, aren't they criminals that are coming through Nogales? I just have to share, quite honestly, it's really hard to be afraid of a 6-year-old who's asking me for another lollipop. So sharing our personal stories, and particularly our stories of hope and resilience, are good first steps for us to move into an encounter as we're talking about migration. I can talk for a long time, so I won't. I'll bring this to an end. But my hope is that as we change our conversations, we can welcome each person and many people with the dignity that they deserve and that we profess to extend as people of faith.
Thank you, Sister Eileen. And I should have mentioned to everyone who's with us that you have an opportunity to ask a question of Sister Eileen or Jennifer or Todd, and you can type those questions in the chat and I will see them and we'll get to them towards the end. But Sister Eileen, before we move to Jennifer, I was just struck by your focus on keeping it person-focused. Strikes me as very important. And I wonder, could you, in that spirit, could you share the story of someone you've been working with just this week, for instance, a story of some specific person?
Yes, well, I'll share a story of a family who's here in our shelter. And little Rose is the 2-year-old daughter of the youngest in a Haitian family who were standing. They had their appointment for to start their asylum process for their initial interview here at the Nogales Port of Entry on January 20th in the afternoon. And if you'll remember, an executive order eliminating the process for asylum was signed immediately after the inauguration. And so everyone who had an appointment that afternoon were waiting for their appointment, and then they were told quite later in the day that they had no chance for asylum, that the whole program had been eliminated. Of course, these families are stuck in Nogales. They don't know where to go. Families from Haiti have left. It's very violent in Haiti. There's not a lot of economic hope for people to have families. And so this family came here to the Kino shelter, and we received them, and they're really trying to figure out where to go now because they can't go back, and they can't move forward where they had hope in going. And so as we're accompanying them and giving them as many resources as we can, one of the things um, that we're noticing is that little Rose is quite a little resilient girl, and she tells Sister Gladys when Sister Gladys should go and get the breakfast ready, and she tells her when she should come back, and that she just tells us, "You tell us to do too many things," she'll say. And so there's this beautiful child playfulness, and this 2-year-old who's beautifully resilient, and a family that is raising her and loving her and holding her in all this, that are looking for what is the next step on our journey. These are people who are just simply looking for safety. They are not safe in the place that they used to call home, that they had to leave, that they didn't want to, and they had hope in reuniting with other family members in the United States, and now they're stuck here. So that's one example of the people who are here that I have the privilege and the blessing of being with.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Sister Eileen. Jennifer Tomshack, why don't we turn to you? Tell us about the Maryknoll lay missioners, and we're going to stay on the U.S. southern border with Mexico, moving towards El Paso, Texas.
Yes. Well, let me start by telling you who Maryknoll is. We are a Catholic mission movement comprised of 4 expressions: the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers, Maryknoll Sisters, Maryknoll lay missioners, and Maryknoll affiliates. We are based in Ossining, New York, just north of New York City. And Maryknoll has been central to the U.S. Catholic Church's overseas mission work for more than a century. The Maryknoll lay missioners were founded in 1975 as a collaborative effort between the Fathers and Brothers and the Sisters. And we are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Since 1975, we have sent nearly 1,000 lay missioners to 35 countries. And they work as teachers, healthcare workers, community advocates, and more. At a minimum, our missioners serve for 3.5 years, but many of our missioners stay for much longer, in some cases, decades. Even after returning from their official missions to the United States, our missioners overwhelmingly stay true to their call and remain very active in service to others. In fact, many return missioners continue to serve the same populations in their home communities that they served in their mission countries. I had the opportunity, with the article I wrote for Living City, to highlight a remarkable couple doing just that. Nearly 35 years after returning from mission in Venezuela, Linda Savio and Bill Hollerman are still serving Venezuelans, this time in their hometown of Seattle, as well as at the border in El Paso. And I learned from them about the unique situation of Venezuelans. They told me that there are nearly 8 million Venezuelans who are displaced globally, and most of them are currently living in Latin America and in the Caribbean. and they're fleeing violent crime, inflation, and food shortages. In the past 2 years, unprecedented numbers of Venezuelans have crossed the border into the United States, and now more than 500,000 are in this country. Many of them have made it up to Washington, which is one of the top refugee resettlement states in the country. And that's where Linda and Bill volunteer with them. They work at an encampment site near Seattle that's run by a Methodist church for hundreds of asylum seekers. They both said that being with Venezuelans feels like home, and they just love working together with them again and being in solidarity with them. So they really felt compelled to do more. And a couple years ago, they went down to El Paso to serve at the border with some of our current Maryknoll lay missioners there. Our history at the border goes back to the mid-1990s, and it was actually returned lay missioners who established our presence there. At that time, NAFTA had recently passed, and there were hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers coming up to the border to Juarez to work in US-owned factories for very little pay. And Maryknoll lay missioners wanted to serve this growing community in need. And it was a return lay missioner named Wes Cosgrove, who also served in Venezuela in the late 80s and early 90s, who helped to lead this new effort at the border. And he once captured it so perfectly. He said, Maryknoll is best known for our work outside the United States, but part of the mission has always been to return and bring the mission home. And the border is where these two worlds of Maryknoll come together. And that's why it's so natural for us to be there. We currently have 3 missioners in El Paso and 1 in Mexicali, Mexico, which is on the California border. 2 of our missioners in El Paso are immigration attorneys, and they work at an organization called Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center, which provides legal services to immigrants and refugees. One of those 2 missioners is also a religious sister. She is a sister of St. Joseph of Springfield, Massachusetts, and she has been missioned to the border by her community via Maryknoll lay missioners. Our 3rd missioner in El Paso works with the other 2, providing hospitality at Annunciation House, which is a longtime El Paso volunteer organization rooted in Catholic social teaching that offers hospitality to migrants, immigrants, and refugees. And they welcome new arrivals, providing shelter, food, clothing, and other assistance while they make travel arrangements to join their families elsewhere. The missioners also serve at Encuentro Project, which is a border immersion program for schools, universities, parishes, and other organizations to learn about the issues facing the border and the asylum seekers who come there. Because there's been so much interest on the part of returned missioners to volunteer at the border, Maryknoll lay missioners and the Maryknoll affiliates, who are laity who commit to the goals of Maryknoll, they last year signed a lease on a house that has 6 bedrooms and space for gatherings. And it's wonderful for us to have a physical space, not just to stay in, but also to foster community as Maryknollers come and go. And we've named it Bethany House. There is a fantastic opportunity coming up for anyone who wants to learn firsthand about our work at the border. We are hosting a mission immersion trip to El Paso and Juarez from March 16th to the 22nd, and you can still register at mklm.org.
Thank you, Jennifer, very much. I want to ask you a question that one of our folks who are watching has posed in the chat. It's from Judith, and because you mentioned that some of the missioners are attorneys, and I would imagine there's a lot going on in that area at the moment. And Judith is asking, what have attorneys done to block executive orders in recent days? Are there missioners involved in some of that kind of work?
Our missioners are working with individuals who are mostly applying for asylum. They come to the border following the law of our land. They have a right to apply for asylum. That's our system, and they're following the regulations and doing the paperwork just like they're supposed to. And our attorneys work with them to help walk them through that process because it's extremely daunting. As you can imagine, when people reach the border, they're exhausted, perhaps dehydrated, perhaps disoriented, and then a giant stack of paper is pushed in front of them in a language that they might not be their first language. They know that being able to understand it is going to determine the future of themselves and their family. And that's where our missioners come in to help them, to help explain it all to them, to help walk them through the basic steps of it so that they can get that application put through and be granted a hearing later.
If you're just joining us, I'm John Sweeney with Living City magazine, published by Focolare Media, and we're talking about migration, what comes next, which is the theme of the issue that is current. And it's a very current issue in the world. It's one of the hot topics going on, certainly throughout North America and in the United States. Our speakers are Sister Eileen McKenzie, who we've heard from, and Jennifer Tomshack. Thank you very much. And we're turning now to Todd Scribner, who has a very busy office today. I have no doubt, because Todd is Assistant Director for Education and Outreach with Migration and Refugee Services at the USCCB, which I'm sure is a job that keeps him busy most of the time anyway. But then just this morning, we saw that Pope Francis issued a document which you could find on the Vatican website. Maybe you've heard about this already, but I thought I would sort of lead into talking with Todd by making reference to this. It is called Letter of the Holy Father Francis to the Bishops of the United States of America. And it begins by saying, I am writing today to address a few words to you in these delicate moments that you are living as pastors of the people of God who walk together in the United States of America. It goes on in the fourth paragraph to say, I have followed closely the major crisis that is taking place in the U.S. with the initiation of a program of mass deportations. The rightly formed conscience cannot fail to make a critical judgment and express its disagreement with any measure that tacitly or explicitly identifies the illegal status of some migrants with criminality. And then it goes on. The Pope has a lot to say. Todd, what happened this morning when you got to work, and this was, what you were facing in addition to everything else?
Well, thanks for having me, John. I really appreciate it, the opportunity to talk to everyone here. When I got to work and I found out about the letter shortly after I arrived, it was a surprise. I don't think anyone was expecting it, at least no one within my circle. But it was very welcome. There's been a significant amount of disruption over the past just 3-4 weeks since the inauguration related to migration and the work of the church on behalf of migrants of all sorts. And so it was very welcome because it was a sign of support really from the top guy, from the Pope himself saying, you're doing a good job, you're supporting, who you're supposed to be supporting, hang in there, basically, and keep at it. So it was rewarding, it was welcome, and it was timely. Because over the past several weeks, as I mentioned, there's been a ton of disruption. And so I want to talk for a few minutes about some of that disruption and some of the executive orders that have been signed by the president and some of their implications. And then briefly just sort of look a little bit at sort of the way in which the church contextualizes its response. We can get into more detail. I know I don't have a ton of time, so we can get into more detail in the Q&A, but I want to talk a little bit about those things because they are important. One of the things that you often hear is that the only thing more complicated, or the only thing perhaps as complicated as tax law is immigration law, because it's just there's so much terminology and so much in and outs and so much confusion in terms of, if you're not a lawyer, and I'm not one, to get a hold of what the different definitions are. And so, regarding these executive orders, just to give you a laundry list. The president put an indefinite suspension on refugee resettlement. When I talk about refugee resettlement, I'm not talking here about the southwest border or anything to do with the southwest border. Refugee resettlement program is a specific program that sort of resettles refugees from overseas through a legal vetted channel into the United States through a legal process. They're given green cards and they're really put on a path to citizenship as a consequence of that. They are strictly defined. If you're a refugee, you flee your country because you're persecuted by, because of your race, your religion, your nationality, political opinion, and you really have to flee for your life. So once you are designated as a refugee, you can be sort of vetted by the US government, brought here into the country legally, rationally, and intentionally. That program is now currently shut down. And so all these people who had to flee their country because of these things are really stuck in a really tough situations overseas. President Trump also declared a national emergency at the border, which allows him to deploy armed forces in order to try and maintain control of the border. He designated drug cartels as a terrorist organization. Along with this sort of deployment of troops at the border, there is concerns that that could result in some sort of intervention into Mexico by sort of the armed services. That's unknown, but it could happen as a consequence of this designation if it's seen as important by the president to, fight the cartels. He enhanced border security by, continuing the building of the wall along the border, of reinstating Remain in Mexico, which is basically a program in which if you applied for asylum into the United States, you had to wait on the Mexican side of the border while your asylum process was ongoing. I mean, this leaves people in really dangerous situations. I mean, it's not necessarily a safe place to be in a lot of sections along the northern border of Mexico. And so, children, women, young men as well are put in vulnerable situations. But at the same time, as was mentioned earlier, he's basically suspended asylum, as a legitimate process. You might see one or two people get in once in a while through an asylum process, but it's incredibly difficult. It's basically shut down. That includes unaccompanied migrant children. So you could have a 13 or 14 or a 15-year-old who can't make it across the border and apply for asylum. The president ended the sensitive locations through a directive. Now, what's sensitive locations? So for a long time, really, there was this kind of tacit agreement through with DHS that there would not be any immigration enforcement in hospitals, schools, or churches, or synagogues, religious places of religious worship. That was ended. And so now that opens the door for possible immigration enforcement. I mean, theoretically, there could be some sort of enforcement mechanism on a Sunday mass or during a Sunday mass or to a local school, on a Wednesday morning when students are there, or, at a hospital where people are trying to get treatment for sickness. And so this is a real concern for us because, there's religious liberty questions. People should be able to go to mass and celebrate their faith, without the fear of deportation. Should be able to send your kids to school without the fear that there's going to be some sort of intervention. So that's really of concern. He put an executive order to end birthright citizenship. So traditionally, for a long time, there was this by the Supreme Court declared that if you're born on U.S. soil, you are a U.S. citizen. And there is opposition to that, by the administration and people within his quarter. And so he's put forward an executive order to end that. That's going to work its way up probably to the Supreme Court, where it's going to be reheard. I think that's the general point, is that he wants to relitigate it in front of the Supreme Court with the hope that they will overturn birthright citizenship. Now, one of the dangers of that is that if you have the potential of kind of having a permanent underclass. So if people are born into the United States, to unauthorized migrant parents or whatever, and they aren't citizens or they're not given birthright citizenship, then there's just going to be a continuing situation in which, people are stuck in some sort of unauthorized sort of liminal status where they're not provided the protections of various sorts that, they're deserving as human persons. And one final one that I'd want to point out too as an executive order, and there's been many others in many different fields, but he put a blanket pause on foreign aid. You might have heard this if you've been watching the closure of the USAID, which is one of the preeminent aid organizations, in the government. But this has really important implications even for migration. Catholic Relief Services, which is the international arm of the Catholic bishops, basically they don't have any funding to do their overseas work anymore. So not only are they going to lay off about 50% of their staff, but they can't do the development work, direct service to sort of local communities to try and provide them support to build economically, to become self-sufficient, to kind of be able to establish the economic and the political institutions that will allow them to be successful in their local community. Same thing with Jesuit Refugee Service, who have overseas sort of work overseas. They've lost a lot of their funding as well. Now, the problem with this is that we're talking about kind of the issue of root causes, right? I mean, what we want to do is we want to provide people the opportunity, economic and otherwise, to thrive in their own country so they don't have to migrate. We want people to sort of, start, be able to send their kids to school, start small businesses, work where they are, so they aren't forced out to another country to find the necessities to make it elsewhere. And so this is really an important and I think key thing to remember when we're talking about the church's work in the migration field. So much attention is given to the border and people coming to the border and trying to come across, and we're trying to stop them. But the church's answer to the border wall is really is the addressing root causes. Let's make the local economies vibrant so they don't have to migrate, because migration should be a choice, not a necessity, at its very basis. Couple of more points. One of the things that you hear a lot about the policy work of the bishops, and that is important. We want to put into place policy that is respectful of the human person and of families in particular, because at the core of society is the family. When the family breaks down, society breaks down. So we need laws that protect families. This is as much within the migration field as anything else. So that's important. Our advocacy work is important. But really central to the mission of the church is the exercise of the corporal works of mercy. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, take care of the sick, visit the imprisoned. I mean, all of these kinds of things can apply to migrants, in some form or fashion, particularly people who are fleeing their homeland and start of a new life. And so our work providing and sort of actively engaging in the corporal works of mercy is crucially important. And one of the things that we have seen are efforts to try to stop the church from doing that, trying to shut down Catholic charities at the border, trying to shut down, other types of institutions that really just provide basic humanitarian and spiritual support, to migrants who are seeking that, after they arrive. But there are efforts in, Texas and elsewhere where they're actively trying to stop the church from doing that. Whatever your position is on a specific policy issue that the bishops may support or oppose, it should outrage you if there are efforts to stop the church from doing its core mission, which is, engaging in the corporal works of mercy. And so I would just urge you all to kind of be mindful of that, to separate those two things to some extent, and to recognize that it's crucial for the church to be doing this work. I would point to a sort of a practical thing, I guess, before I turn it back over to John. I'll put into the chat box. If you go to our justiceforimmigrants.org, it's basically a national coalition that the bishops have launched about 20 years ago, just to try and to work on these migration issues. It's a coalition of national Catholic organizations. Maryknoll is a part of the Justice for Immigrants campaign. There we've collected a lot of resources, a lot of tips, a lot of sort of information on what the bishops do. One thing in particular is there's a page that we were tracking, and we're keeping track of the statements that are made by bishops across the country on the immigration issue. And they're really statements in support of migrants and the work of the church in this regard. This is sort of parallel to the Pope's message. It'll help you show that the solidarity and the sort of the unique positions that the church hold and the bishops hold really there's a cohesiveness to what the bishops are supporting. And I would also ask, if you are interested in doing so, to join the listserv. And in joining the listserv, we'll send you like an email once every 2 weeks or so, maybe a little bit more often, but we won't inundate you. Just trying to keep you up to date on what the church is doing, in the migration field. We won't inundate you, I promise, but it is a good way just for you to kind of keep track of what's happening in this field, what the bishops are doing, what the larger church is doing, what are the concerns, what are the issues, where are they falling on policy, and what you can do to help people in your local community. I'll put those in the chat box, and I'll turn it over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Todd. I just want to quickly say we have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to turn to those now, and maybe have about 15 minutes left. And I want everyone to know that you can see the names of our speakers here on your screen, but the organizations that they are a part of, I want to remind you, are the Kino Border Initiative, which is kinoborderinitiative.org, the Maryknoll Lay Missioners, which is mklm.org, and the USCCB, which is usccb.org. And speaking of these .orgs and ways of getting in touch with people, Todd, a very quick question to you from one of the folks who are watching is, from Susanna saying, can we please have Todd Scribner's contact information? I am a director of Hispanic ministry in the Diocese of Lansing and would love to be in touch. Can you tell people how to get a hold of you?
Yeah, I will put my email address in the chat box. It's T Scribner, so my first initial and my last name, at usccb.org. You can just drop me an email, and I'll certainly respond, I promise.
Great, thank you. And now I'm going to turn with a question to Sister Eileen and to Jennifer from Fred, who is watching. The question is, have either organization in El Paso or Nogales been impacted by the current administration threatening to revoke nonprofit status? Could the two of you each take a minute and answer that question?
I'll go ahead and go first, Jennifer. The Kino Border Initiative is a binational organization. So we're both in the United States and in Mexico. So it's a little complicated. I'm not in the administrative side, thank goodness. But we have not had any impact from those threats to date that I'm aware of. Jennifer?
Yeah, so our missioners serve at Annunciation House in and you may have heard about this. This made national news last year. The Texas Attorney General tried to shut down Annunciation House twice and failed. It's a long-time institution in the city. It has overwhelming support from the community. It's very respected. It has support from city government, including the mayor, law enforcement, the local bishop, the bishops' conference, and even Pope Francis chimed in on it on CBS News, saying that shutting down Annunciation House would be, quote, sheer madness. But the Texas Attorney General is still persevering and trying to shut it down, and oral arguments were made to the Texas Supreme Court in January, and we are awaiting that decision.
Thank you, both of you. Another question here. This one is for Todd. There was a charge, I think it was from Vice President Vance. The question comes from Pat, who's watching, and I think he's referring, my memory is that this originated with Vice President Vance, but correct me, Todd, maybe if I'm wrong. But there was a charge that went out that the bishops, the Catholic bishops, are trying to profit from migration in some way. And a lot of us who are sort of ordinary Catholics really had no idea what that could possibly mean. Todd, can you suggest what that might mean? Is there anything to it? Could you just address that?
Yeah, sure. There is nothing to it. First of all, so he made a statement in which he said that the bishops had better look at their own bottom line because they're making millions off the resettlement of illegal immigrants. That's paraphrased. First of all, the use of the term resettlement is actually really a term that's really applied to refugees. So he's confusing intentionally or otherwise. I'm not going to judge motivation. What we're doing when we're resettling refugees. That's who we resettle. And again, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, the refugee resettlement process is an established legal resettlement program that is overseen by the federal government, and it is processed by intermediate institutions like the Catholic Church, also the Lutherans. You have Church World Service and some other organizations that are resettlement agencies who participate in this legally established program to bring refugees who are fully vetted, by the U.S. government into the country, legal means, and under a green card. so that they can then eventually, in all likelihood, receive citizenship. We do receive money from the federal government to do that, but we do not make money off of it. Oftentimes we are, particularly at the local level, like a local Catholic charities, who we, work with closely to actually resettle a particular refugee or a refugee family. They put a ton of time and a ton of money into the trying to get refugees, and very successfully most of the time, self-sufficient and established in their locality. And so they have to oftentimes, invest a lot more money than they're actually getting from the federal government. So we're not profiting from this. We are, in fact, probably spending money more often than not on the overall program, money and or time, or it could be through the provision of furniture and bringing kids to school or to doctor's appointments, that sort of thing, than we're getting from the federal government. So we're not getting rich.
Thank you, Todd. A question for you, Jennifer. You mentioned a mission trip related to migration that's coming up in March. And Patricia, who is watching, wants to just know a little bit more about that. What does one do on such a trip?
Sure. So it's a combination of daily tasks and prayer and reflection and community. This particular trip will be visiting, going into Juarez and visiting a migrant shelter there to prepare meals, and also gathering together to pray and reflect. Also meeting with experts in many different areas, in the areas of migrant care, law enforcement, legal issues, public policy, advocacy, Catholic social teaching, and pastoral care. It's really a fabulous educational opportunity to meet with people who are right there doing it, and to learn to get their take on it. I did something similar in November, and I thought I knew the issues in and out, but once you're actually there and you see it for yourself, and you meet the people who are doing the work and meet the people who are being helped by it, it's completely different, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you. I have a question from Maddie, which I'm going to pose to all three of you. The question is that the administration has a faith office at the White House, and that's not unique to this administration. But the question is that it seems that the current administration is working against faith principles in the field of migration. Certainly, according to the presentations we've heard here, it seems that way. I'm going to kind of twist the question to say, in your organizations, in the Kino Border Initiative, in the Maryknoll Missioners, in the USCCB, is there a difference of opinion as to how faith responds to migration, or do you speak with one voice? I mean, Maddie asked the question basically by saying, how can you have a faith office and then work against faith principles? But I'm asking, is there confusion on these topics that we've been discussing here among the folks in your own organizations?
I'll speak from the Kino perspective. We really don't have any confusion at the Kino Border Initiative. It's very clear to us that accompanying and advocating for people on the move is part of our Catholic and Christian call. We recognize that there's a lot of confusion regarding policies and narratives, but the simple Good Samaritan parable is something that guides us. The question of who is my neighbor and how do we treat each other with dignity and compassion is they're just unifying Christian values that support where we go with this. Our vision really is migration with dignity, and it upholds that these are people, these are families that we're talking about, and all of us have just being, but by virtue of being human, have the right to be treated with dignity. And so we accomplish that through humanitarian aid, but we also accomplish it through educational reasons, or educational purposes, through creating encounters with people at different parts of the journey, and through political advocacy in both Mexico and the United States. So we're very clear, and we're not confused at all in what it is. We recognize, however, that there is a lot of fear. And so when we hear that we need to be strong on crime, because the word illegal seems to be married with the word migration or immigration, that's something that we try to intentionally detangle. We don't find that the 6-year-olds and the families that we work with are the criminals that are in a lot of the narrative in the media. And so I would say that we have unifying factors. We're not confused, but we recognize that there's a lot of misinformation being spread right now that we're trying to be more clear about.
Jennifer, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sister Eileen there. I think I think it is really clear. And so, it's just all this disinformation that it's very intentional, and almost Orwellian use of certain words. It's so disturbing, and yet it's been very effective with a lot of people, and we need to combat it, with our own language choices as well.
Thanks. And Todd, how about you? I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but the
No,
bishops
that's
don't
fine.
all agree, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a fundamental discontinuity between what the bishops are teaching on migration and what the current administration stakes out as their positions on migration. And there is no real confusion on our end as to what the position properly understood should be. Um, we have to also recognize that the faith office as such is not representative of a religious organization or a faith tradition. It's really just the intermediary between the administration in place and faith organizations out there. So it's kind of a point of contact that faith organizations can use to kind of communicate with the administration. So, I mean, I think it's important to situate what that faith office is. It's not really in a position to make declaratives as to what sort of the proper interpretation of the Catholic faith is on these issues. They simply don't have that authority. They're merely a kind of a bureaucratic interfacing kind of organization between us and other faith groups and the administration itself.
Thank you. We just have a couple of minutes left to our speakers. If I could point you to the chat, you'll see what I'm about to read, the very last question that just came in from Carlos. Greetings from Canada. He says, this is Carlos, full-time director at Action Refugees Montreal, a ministry of the Anglican and Presbyterian churches. I also work with initiatives in Mexico. I would love to join forces with you guys to advocate and bring assistance to asylum seekers. And then Carlos puts a phone number there. So I just wanted to make sure you all saw that so you can put Carlos into your networks and so on. Well, if anyone has something they want to add from our speakers here, we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. But I think we are at a terrific place, and we've had a great conversation about migration and what happens next. A lot of things happen next, I think, is basically the answer to the question. And you all are involved very closely in what's going on. Some of it's going to be in the courts, and a lot of it is happening on the ground. And I thank you all for your work. Does anyone have something that they want to say here at the close?
Just thank you for giving us and for giving me and us, I think more generally, the opportunity to talk to y'all, and have an opportunity just to talk about what the church is doing, why we're doing it, where we're trying to get, together. And, it's always nice to have these kind of forums to do that.
I just want to add that, it's easy to feel disheartened right now, but there are so many people doing amazing work we just don't hear about them. You know, those aren't the people who make the news. It's usually people who are trying to create difficulties as opposed to people who are trying to fix problems.
Yeah, and I would agree with what's been said. This has been just a real wonderful opportunity. And I find like there's a lot of hope in over 200 people coming in on this conversation. We do have a call. I think we're responding to the call. We're in it for the long term. And I would just ask for continued prayers and work.
Well, Todd, Sister Eileen, Jennifer, Keno Border Initiative, USCCB, Maryknoll Missioners, thank you all for what you're doing. This conversation will be on YouTube probably by tomorrow, and you can share it with others then as well. But until then, and until next time, thanks for joining us for this Living City conversation.